Is that a good or a bad idea when individuals are entering a market where they don't really have direct experience?
You're going to make some mistakes if you don't have direct experience. But the other way to look at that,
Craig Dickens is a serial entrepreneur and CEO of a prominent and well-respected investment bank. He is an expert in mergers and acquisitions.
revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is king. Banks never lend you money when you need it, only when they want to lend you money when you don't need it, right?
How is this new wave of AI influencing your decisions?
You mentioned both organic and inorganic growth strategies. And could you describe a little bit more about what that means and which one's better when it comes to scaling?
It depends is the first answer. And the second answer is,
Welcome, Craig.
thanks for having me. Looking forward to today.
Yeah, welcome. I feel like you need to add another 7 to that. So it's 777 and then head to Vegas.
That's right. I've played that game before. So yeah, good.
So, Craig, you founded 7 businesses. That was as a startup founder before you went into acquiring business. Is that correct?
A little bit of both, but yeah, like anyone else with limited resources in my 20s, I tried to turn my passion into a business, mostly to fund my passion, right? And a lot of people start that way, right? They have a hobby and they want to turn it into a business. So I did that with triathloning, and started a little triathlon business of selling the latest and greatest, right? So that was my first one. And I ran it out of my closet and eventually sold it to one of the big players in the business. But
That's awesome.
Started as a passion for sure.
That's great. And then did you interweave between some of the acquisitions between there, or were they all your startups first and then you went straight to acquisition?
No, it was a little bit of both. And I've kind of, people use that word serial entrepreneur, and I think that fits. But in some instances, I was also what's called a parallel entrepreneur, having 2 companies at once. And sometimes I would have a partner in a business and it's like, okay, well, this can't really, satisfy both of our growing families. So you go run that one, I'll go run this one. So there were a couple of those. Yeah. And then from an acquisition standpoint, a couple came about initially that were opportunistic. People approached us, and then we started getting more sophisticated and ultimately saying, well, now we need to, grow a little bit quicker and be more intentional about going after acquisitions.
Okay. So
kind of a maturation process.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Do you have a preference? Do you prefer the startup or the acquisition, or you like bolting both together?
Props to all the startup folks out there. It's a ton of work and you end up wearing a lot of hats. I don't care what your scale is, but, startup is definitely not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
And it's usually a little more risky, right? Because you don't have product market fit. You're kind of flying the plane while you're building it. So I would say at this stage, and all that I've learned, I prefer to acquire or bring together several businesses just because, you're de-risked and there's more meat on the bone, so to speak, that way.
What's your criteria of the type of businesses you kind of look into or the opportunities that come to you?
I think, it's interesting. We're at an interesting inflection point in the marketplace and, it's been around for a while, but we are focused. I also have kind of a family office where we do direct investing in companies. And we're very much interested in the subscription economy. So anything that has a membership or a subscription, most people, when you say a subscription, they go, oh, SaaS, you're interested in SaaS. Well, there's a lot of businesses that are not SaaS-based businesses that rely on subscriptions and that recurring revenue model. So we're very focused on that type of business. To give you an example, we co-invested with another private equity group in a car wash chain that has 10 units. And a lot of that business is transferring from show up with cash to show up and sign up for a membership. And now you've got a subscription to a car wash, and it's become that kind of a model. So we're very focused on that nowadays.
I subscribe to our local car wash. It's one of the drive-through ones.
Yep.
It just makes some sense. I mean, and it's so cheap. I think the subscription is like less than $20 to $25, unlimited usage. So it's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, and that model, right? When you think about it, you think about the big companies that are subscription based. You see Salesforce, right? I mean, that's the bellwether kind of when you think about subscriptions. But like I said, even those old line businesses, there's a lot of them businesses now. Your HVAC, Your HVAC company used to, never know when they were going to go to someone's house. And when they got there, most of the time the filters were disgusting because the homeowner didn't trade them out, right? And they usually call you when there's a problem at 3 a.m. Well, now even those companies are saying, hey, let's get on an annual or a biannual. We'll come replace your filters for $39.99 a visit.
Yeah.
We do it so that you never miss it and your house is, always beautifully clean, etc. And we do preventative maintenance on your HVAC. So they've taken a once every 3 years, $300 to $1,500 bill, and they've turned it into this recurring revenue stream. So now they're a service provider to your home. And sometimes people will even give them the garage code and come in and change my filters. So that model, there's a lot of uptake in that model these days.
From a consumer standpoint, there might be a little bit of fatigue with a lot of subscription because at the home, people default to, I have Netflix, I have Disney Plus. And then when you actually look into it, you have a gym, you have a massage membership, you have it adds up. But next thing you know, it's $2,000-$3,000 of memberships a month. How would you tackle that from the acquisition side of things to increase kind of the success of it?
Yeah, like a SaaS business and other businesses that have kind of you almost apply those same metrics to these type of business. What's your customer acquisition cost? What is your LTV, right? Your long-term, value of that customer. And it's really become a very metrics-driven business model. But really the impetus for that fatigue that you mentioned, if you were to look at some of the data and they say, well, what can you not do without, right? Yeah. Everybody talks about, we're going to save some money this month. I'm going to do without my Netflix subscription. But then you're like, yeah, that lasted for a month and now I need to go back to Netflix, right? So the key is building that relationship and, dare I say, that dependency. And the only way you do that is by building value and offering more value. It didn't take you long in your car wash subscription to say, you know what, if I come twice a month, I'm making money, right? So that's value. So that's where subscriptions have a longer life, and people would rather, on those top 5 important things to them, they'd rather just set it and forget it than have the stress or the decision fatigue of, well, should I get my car washed this week or not? Nope. All I got to do is go twice and it's dirty. So let's go. Right. They put that in the mindset, but I definitely also feel in my, on my phone, there's an app that watches my subscription so that, all of a sudden it's, I'm up to $2,000-$3,000. Like, wait a minute, something's got to give here.
Right. So, yeah. No.
Happy medium.
Crazy. Well, I think some of the ones too that are interesting with like what you mentioned with HVAC as an example is that's also for them a good opportunity once they're there for the upsells, or honestly, and the upsell may not be, it sounds mischievous when I say that because some people think about it in those terms, but it could truly be they're looking at something. They're like, here's the thing. It's kind of like your tires on your car. You could get away with one more season for this, but keep in mind, if it goes down, here's what happens. If it goes down in the, middle of winter, just, be warned if you're in a place like I am. And I think with that, as you even mentioned, here's a garage door code. It's like those things, you start to build this trust because that area, any of the home services, rarely do I know people who have that person who they rely on because it is so periodic when they do this service or when they see somebody, and then they'll just call based on whatever it was or what comes up in the search. So if you could create that sort of repeat habit with them, it could be so valuable.
Well, nowadays, finding labor, and this helps the subscription model, right? If you can build your business and you can go to your employees and say, I'm going to add another plumber, because I have, instead of just break fix emergency work, I have, ongoing work, or whether it be HVAC or anything else, not just home services, but, you can build some reliability for your employee base, and your customers don't get frustrated that, I can't find someone to do this job for me. Right. And that's where you see all these like TaskRabbits and some of these other subscription based, not just project based things come about. So it's an interesting time in the market for sure.
Yeah. How much, and this might kind of be strange me asking, but how much does it, when you look at these businesses, sometimes I think there's a thought of, well, X percentage might just forget that they're paying for it. How much of that comes into play? And are there metrics to track, out of, I'm making 100% of subscriptions, X percentage actually just keep paying because they forget even they have it?
Yeah, there's a certain element of that. By the same token, and I don't want to make the business seem more glamorous than it is, but by the same token, there's also issues like people that want to be customers, but their credit card is expiring and they just don't see the text or don't see the email. And, so that's called involuntary churn. So, there's kind of an equal amount. And if you think back to the car wash scenario, for every person that doesn't use it in a month, let's say they're a snowbird and they go to, LA or Arizona or something, right? And they're not home to use it. There's some churn there, but there's also the Uber driver that comes every 2 days, right? That hammers the membership and gets tremendous value. So I think you have to look at it in aggregate and that it kind of all works out in the end. But the name of that game is LTV and how long you have that client. But the only real way you keep that client or customer is if you're providing value. So at the end, they're going to go away if they're not using it. They'll wake up one day and somebody will say, well, what's this $38 charge every month, right? So,
well, and not to go too far down that pathway, but like a lot of companies acknowledging that's where they have campaigns that start to kick in, that sometimes the proactive ones in advance are like, hey, notice you haven't been, here, whatever it might be. And like, they try to figure out how to reactivate, because if not, the chances of them not activating at all again at the end of it is over. So I think it's a short-sighted approach that some companies might take in the end here, but usually the ones who are really looking at it, I mean, the gyms have the bad name for it because they're known for that sort of thing happening. But even the gyms realize that if they don't find a way to activate them sooner versus later, as soon as, X mark kicks in, they're gone. So you want to get them in there and create this sort of sense of community or something.
Well, my gym story is kind of funny because I signed up to a membership, which then I think was Bally's, and then it got bought by LA Fitness. I had such a cheap membership and I said, it's too valuable. I'm not going to cancel this. So for probably about 7-8 years, I've paid and never gone once. And then just recently I started going back, but it was always hard to cancel because I knew the replacement would cost so much more.
So you stuck it to yourself for a while, waiting until
I stuck it to myself because I'm like, at some point I'm going to want to go back and I don't want to spend 3x.
Not to be a finance geek, but there's something in behavioral finance called the endowment effect. And if I own it already, it's more important to me. And then you throw on the aspirational, someday I'm going to get buff and I can't quite possibly let go of that membership. My wife and I have had battles about the why. It's like, well, you don't go, but I'm like, by golly, I'm keeping it, right? So
it's part of your
psychology of that thing is really interesting, right?
Yeah.
When the consumer...
It's your identity. And I think that, it becomes your identity. And then if you let that go, you're letting go of some of who you are.
Exactly.
I am curious though, just, specific to when you are looking at the business acquire, because you mentioned again, subscription, and we've gone, down this rabbit hole a bit, but for you, do you like companies that already have a subscription model in place? Because now when you buy, there's already reoccurring revenue, or do you prefer the ones where you see the opportunity because now you can buy it at I don't want to say discount, but you could buy it at a lower price and build that on yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with, as every time you look at an investment, you want to look at it in comparison to other investments in the space to figure out whether you have a leader, a neutral, or a laggard kind of company in the space as it compares to its peers. And then you analyze, and I know we talked a little bit in, kind of pre-call about buy versus build. How much of a lift, how much heavy lifting is it going to be to convert this business from XYZ business model to a subscription model? And you kind of have to factor that into it, right? Do you need a direct sales force? Do you need more digital assets? I mean, there's a lot to think about. And I guess going back to our first question about startup versus existing, I would rather try to maximize or find someone that is along that journey and already doing it, but has a lot of headroom and a lot of room to grow, because you're not training the culture and the organization how to sell something different.
Makes sense.
And you do get that revenue visibility by at least having the sprouts or the inklings or the 10%, 20, 30% recurring on your way to trying to turn it into, 80, 90% recurring. So that would be my preference. You'd have to buy something really cheap to convert its business model and have some visibility as to whether you're going to be successful or not, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
It's like, if we tried to take a subscription model for dentistry, right? So we all know we're going to go to the dentist. We hate it. We put it off, right? Would that really encourage me to go to the dentist a little bit sooner if I was paying $50 a month for dentist services? it's like I'm still going to hate going to the dentist. I'm still not going to go until I absolutely need to, right? So it's like some models work, some models don't. So
My doctor just converted his practice to $1,000, $1,500 a year membership practice.
mhm.
So now I'm stuck kind of trying to decide, do I opt in or try to find a new doctor? But then it's a little difficult because I have a relationship there, a lot of history. Smart on his part. It just put me in a decision point.
Smart will be, depends on the LTV again. Depends on what happens.
That's right. That's right. If you think about doctors, and the average physician visit is 15 minutes and the average person goes 3 times a year, right? And that's on average. That includes the kids for the peds appointments and whatever.
Yeah.
So, 15, I think he's making money. I think that's a wise choice on his part.
It's pretty interesting. You mentioned both organic and inorganic growth strategies, and could you describe a little bit more about what that means and which one's better when it comes to scaling?
Yeah, so it's one of those answers that nobody likes, right? It depends is the first answer, and the second answer is really both, right? You get to a point where growing from $500,000 to $2 million is pretty easy, right, for most people. But growing from 50 million to 100 million is a little trickier. It's a different set of problems to just do that with organic growth. On the one hand, you already have a brand and you have recognition. It should be easier to acquire new clients. On the other hand, those clients you're going to be in a more competitive marketplace. You're going to lose more than you win, et cetera. Right. So I think the strategy is both. You try to grow organically, keep providing that value to the customer base, look for niches or areas, whether it be product differentiation or product expansion, or even market expansion to find those organic growth wells, if you will. But ultimately, if you can buy some technology, if you can buy some market, if you can buy some talent, right, or all three of those things, it helps you augment that organic growth. Both are risky, right? You're usually investing behind organic growth to keep that coming, and then you're also investing in the mergers or acquisition side of it to find the inorganic growth. So to me, it's like working both levers, right, on the dial.
And back to what you said with the larger companies, I mean, you see that all the time with the Googles, the Apples of the world that are buying existing, again, technologies or literally teams because they want the teams in there. So they buy their company out just to get the teams in. That would be some examples of what you'd call the inorganic versus the organic, right?
Yeah, and even within that, there's so many subsets, right? So what you just described is almost like an acqui-hire, where you want the team and the technology, right? And what was the famous example where Facebook paid 19 billion for like a 7-person team? They wanted the technology, and the team came along with it. But yeah, it's definitely there's a lot of reasons why people acquire. Some could be to fill gaps, some could be to bring on new leadership, some could be technology, some could just be market share. Maybe they just have been skunked in a particular market and they're like, forget about it. We're just going to buy it, right? So a lot of reasons to think about acquisitions for sure.
Well, and then maybe I'm wrong in thinking about it this way, but going back to that whole buy versus build, because again, that's, there's a lot of people out there these days who are saying you should buy instead because building, again, what you had mentioned earlier about some of the special breed of individual that could take. And then there's also theoretically the failure rate that people highlight a lot.
Yep.
Do you think one is better than the other, or do you think it's dependent on the individual? I mean, you might have a preference now, but I guess how should somebody determine which one is right for them?
Yeah, great question. And there's a lot to unpack there. I think, theoretically, every purchase or let's call it investment, every investment decision, you have to have some skin in the game, right? So you have to be willing to put some chips on the table and ante up. And the degree to which you have the risk tolerance to do that, right, is one real large gating factor, right? You might not, you might prize security over risk. That's one part of it. The other part of it is time. Again, think like an investor. If I have $1 and I want to turn that dollar into two, how long is it going to take me to do that?
Yeah.
So some people would say, okay, if I have an established business, it's going to take me half the time to turn that dollar into two than if I just did it myself and did $1, $1.10 the first year, $1.20 the second year, right? And so on. So those are the two factors people need to think about: their risk and how much they're willing to kind of lay on the line, as well as how much time they want to take to meet their goals. And then it becomes, once you make that decision, then you have to spin up the machinery. You have to kiss a lot of frogs, right, so to speak, to find the right business for you. And I've seen it the other way too, right? I've seen Microsoft executives that have made $500,000 a year at Microsoft and have stock options, and they want to own a pizza parlor.
Yeah.
I'm like, really? You had $1 billion budget at Microsoft. And now you want to, let's think about this, right? You can do it tomorrow. You can write the check for it, but is that business really right for you? So sometimes it takes a little trial and error for folks to think about that as well.
On that note, retail and food industry, do you stay away from them?
Well, so I was one of the first investors in what I'll call a category of home meal replacement.
Okay.
So these are specific companies. There's one up here that was here for years, Dream Dinners, they called it, where typically the model was, 10 or 12 gals or guys would come in and they'd, crack a bottle of wine, and they'd have a bunch of recipes that were basically out in front of them that they could assemble, home meal assembly, right?
Yeah.
So that was one business that that I started early with a partner and ended up selling that one. But I kind of promised my wife that I would never get in the restaurant business, just because it's a very hard business, very high failure rate, and it's I don't want to say this disparagingly, but it can often be tough on families, right? Because it's kind of counter-cyclical to family life. If you're at the restaurant or the bar till 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. or whatever, it's like, you're missing out on some things, right? Yeah. So I stayed away from the hardcore restaurant, but I know friends that have wonderful restaurants and have raised great families, right? So it's really kind of up to you. The food business traditionally, as I get older, I think about, what makes the highest margin.
Yeah.
So that you can make some mistakes and still have a reasonable, return on your investment. And the food business, theoretically, it's a little fickle for me. And on the food processing side of it, the margins are, 2 to 10, 11%, right? So it's not where I want to spend my days these days.
That makes sense. You've said that you can fix a bad company, but not a bad industry. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, and if there's industries people should avoid?
Yeah, it's any company can be turned around, but if the underlying macroeconomic principles, do not align with the marketplace, then it's trouble, right? Let's take Juul e-cigarettes, right? Would you place $1 in Juul e-cigarettes? Now, wonderful. I'm not making any judgment on e-cigarettes, but they're in the middle of lawsuits and craziness, and right? It's like, man, and it's one step over from the tobacco industry, which is taking heat for years, right? So why would you be passionate about that? That's asking for some more brain damage, right?
Yeah.
So you really have to think about the industry itself. If you come from a wholesale sales background where you need to have $100 million worth of sales to generate 2% in returns because it's wholesale, you're the middleman, is that where you want to spend your time, right? Again, the world moves on wholesale trade, but you really have to make that judgment as to whether that's the right industry for you. Now, and along the lines of Juul, some people have, do I want to be in the alcohol business, right? Or do I want to be in the sin business, right? Hotels and casinos, right?
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that, but you've got to make that decision.
How has this new wave of AI influencing your decisions?
Yeah, it's amazing. People first look at when you buy a company, especially we talked about add-ons, you're always looking for sales synergies. If I buy this, what sales synergies can they give me? And then you're also looking for cost or savings efficiencies, right? And we've had at the investment banking level, we've had lots of clients that are looking to kind of onboard technology that can dramatically affect either their sales or their costs. I don't see how any company out there will not be affected one way or another with AI. The tricky part for me with AI is, while I like investing in technology companies, AI is just that further out there that I don't quite understand it in the long term. We're still in the hype cycle of AI. And I view it as more of a tool or an enabler or some kind of tech enablement, right? Versus a pure play, we are an AI company, because already we've got Google and Microsoft and all of those, big players that are going to dominate that. And the CapEx that, I mean, it sucks up a lot of cash before you're an overnight success, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
So that one's a tough one.
Now, even today, what is it? Microsoft, others are like, let's go and buy nuclear power plants so that we could generate the power that we need to, like, it's
Right.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's forcing you to be vertically integrated to support your great idea, which, I mean, that's a world beating idea, but you need world beating deep pockets to pull that off, right?
And as you say that, with deep pockets. So debate I've personally had as I've looked at business acquisition has been around, okay, what's the right size of business to acquire? Because, you could argue and say, okay, looking for a business that has, 700, 500, 750K, I'm going to simplify it, but cash flow, we'll just say SDE, however you want to look at it. But I'm going to hire a general manager in here too, and then, by the time it gets down to it, you're down to a certain amount that you actually have. Maybe there's also another hire you have or some other investment because they never did anything around marketing. So like for me, that number, I looked at a lot as I'm like, well, if you're going to buy a business, no matter what, you still have a level of marketing you have to do. You are still looking at, if you are trying to not be, no matter what, to me, there's still a level of involvement. But if your idea is to not be in day-to-day management as much, then you have to plan for that. And that's where trying to acquire these smaller businesses is a bit harder. Do you look at it in those terms, or are you looking at it as such a high term anyway that you're like, no, I want something that already has, 10 million or 12 shops? Like how would you recommend that somebody approaches that? Both, I guess I would say, especially if they're at the scale of anybody listening to the now who's like, I'm thinking about buying a business.
Yeah, I think that's a really important consideration, right? In any acquisition, if you're buying an existing business, there has to be some sort of team. Now, it can be an outsourced team, it can be a team overseas, it can be, all manner of team. But if you're buying a one-person thing, somebody's got to replace that one person,
Yeah,
right? And that's going to be you unless you hire somebody, right? And I think a lot of acquirers go into a business and think, well, I know better, right? Well, chances are the person that's been doing it knows it pretty well. No, they may not have all the skill sets to grow it or scale it that you can bring to it. But yeah, the whole notion of passive income, I'm just going to, be a serial entrepreneur and buy all these businesses, sit back and cash checks. It's a fallacy, right? There's, Gary V and others are, all over the internet talking about that. But, yeah, it's you've got to figure out what you're wanting to buy. And there's nothing wrong with buying a job, right? If you're tired of working for the man and you're like, hey, I've got some extra shekels and I'm going to go buy this and I'm going to be the guy operating it, terrific, right? And that's a great, you learn real quick about working capital, cash flow, profit and loss, and so that's a great education. I tend to think about that team. And you're buying an excellent team, a mediocre team, or a really poor team, and you're buying the culture that goes along with that, even if it's a 2 or 3 man business, right, or a 10-man business or person business. So the team is really important, especially if you have designs to be at the board level or the senior leader level, where you're not actually rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work. So never underestimate diligencing that team, because that's a lot of what you're buying.
Can you drill a little bit deeper on that? How would you go about actually evaluating a team that you've never worked with? And it's, someone along the lines of like when you're hiring somebody in the interview process, that's all you get. But in this situation, how would you go about understanding how efficient and how good the team is versus how much they're putting off to be as?
As a kind of professional buyer, if you will, right, with that mindset, there's probably 100 different ways, but I'm going to go back to my grandma's old saying, it all comes out in the wash, right? So if you're having conversations, if you're interviewing the team, if you're looking at Yelp reports, right, or Google reviews, right, you'll get a good feel for what's going on. And then when you get into diligence and buying a company and you say, all right, now it's the time where I get to interview the team, as polished as they might be, you keep talking and you'll learn a lot. And really, as you get better at it, the quality of the questions you ask. I happened to sit in on an interview just yesterday helping one of our portfolio companies.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked a question about, metrics and scorecards and all of that. And if you get an answer that says, oh, yeah, the KPIs and the scorecards are really important, and we review those every week. And this particular candidate, if you will, said, well, we look at this KPI and that one, we look at that one weekly. All of a sudden, you can tell it's not a theoretical answer, that they really live and eat, sleep, and breathe by the data and the numbers. I'm like, check the box. That team knows what they're doing, right? They're walking the walk. So really, the quality of the questions that you learn to and like I said, some of those data enabled, you secret shop them, right? You order the product. I'm looking at a company that makes electronics, and I ordered a product off Amazon or off of their website. I think I ordered it. This one wasn't off of Amazon. I got the product, the look and the feel. I made sure it arrived within 2 days, and I did my onboarding, and I fired up the product, and I called customer service, and I got a feel for. And then I watched my email, building that relationship, getting me to use the adoption, right? Get the product embedded into my lifestyle. So yeah, you can tell a lot behind the scenes as well as asking the right questions for sure.
And I think with that, sometimes that approach that you took, the, secret shop or however you want to call it, kind of thing, is important too, because correct me if I'm wrong, but some companies, especially ones that are, I don't know, somewhere in that small to mid level where they don't want their employees knowing that they're selling because the deal could fall through. You may not. So have you ran into that with any of the companies?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's, and sometimes you get better access, than others. It really depends. And it depends what the culture looks like. And it depends if they have some good advice. If they have a good investment banker that will say, okay, this is a reasonable request. There's a lot of ways you can tell your team that, somebody's looking to invest in the business, or we're looking to partner for growth or something like that, that they can kind of help ease that concern, because it's a real concern.
Yeah.
But yeah, and sometimes, and again, I'm kind of boots on the ground when it comes to these things. If I'm looking at a place that has a physical facility, first thing I do is go drive around in the back and see what the back looks like. Is it a dump? And I literally go to the dumpster and I'm like, all right, what are they throwing out in this business, right?
Interesting.
And how well are they maintaining that? Because that tells me a lot about what they're doing inside.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of tricks of the trade, so to speak, that you can pick up some things, and
That's awesome.
and finding a way to interact. Sometimes I'll just sit and watch activity and the comings and goings.
Yeah.
How many trucks are showing up? Right? How many deliveries? How much? You can learn a lot by just paying attention.
You're a detective or forensics almost.
Yeah. I mean, we like to be fully transparent and ask all the questions up front, but you also got to double check for what's real, right?
It's just like any interview. A person comes in, they say all these things, and then as soon as you dig a little bit deeper, or you realize, oh, that reference wasn't real, or they never went to school at what? Yeah, unfortunately, those realities.
Yeah, and or we're famous for show me some examples of what you just described. Can you redact it? We don't want you to share anything confidential, but if you're a process guy, show me what process you put in place and what the ROI was, right? What's the return on that? Yeah. And it's like, right. Well, it's really the larger team and I didn't do it. And, the truth comes out, right?
Yeah. Now, is that a red flag for you in that case? Or is that let's keep our guard up a little bit as we continue to go through and make sure we can mitigate that risk?
It depends. And a lot of it is, you're also doing character assessments of sellers and buyers, and finding out who's who. There's some truisms or axioms in our business, whether it be on the investment banking side or buying and selling companies. And I would say my biggest learning there is, don't buy from a crook, right? If you start seeing that they're running every expense through the business to, trick Uncle Sam a little too much, right? And save some taxes, that's probably a sign that other things might be going on.
Right.
So you just, to a degree, you got to follow your gut, but then there's folks that do the background checks that can validate your gut, right?
Sure. That's fair. There's a show I used to love called The Prophet on CNBC with Marcus Lemonis, and he'd go in and it was always interesting because you could see in some of these cases, you're like, man, look at these red flags popping up with the way these individuals are operating there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And who you want to partner with, right? Because a lot of times on the buy side, we'll go in and, you're going to have that CEOs stick around for a while, they're going to be your partner, your business
Right.
partner. And, you want that relationship to be transparent. You want it to be honest both ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you get those feelings that, somebody's really defensive about a part of their business that, you don't want to be the know-it-all, but by the same token, you're like, ooh, I got to pay attention to that. Why are they so concerned about this,
Yeah.
right? Why is that such a scab that we're picking by asking a question, right?
Sure.
So yeah, at the end of the day, buying and selling businesses is about people, and it's about, mutual trust for sure.
And for you, when looking for businesses, is there a certain approach that you normally take in finding them, or is it good old biz buy sell? Like, how do you come across businesses?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer kind of generically because we do a little bit of both. But there, and nowadays, you mentioned Art, and you mentioned the AI, right? There's even AI databases that will have signals or intent to sell.
Interesting.
It's probably not a mystery. Somebody gets up in their 60s, right? 70s, they might be thinking about
Oh, I see.
liquidity, right? So
Good
there's
point.
some easy things.
Yeah.
But we will reach out if we have an interest in a sector.
Mm-hmm.
We will reach out to companies in that sector, to get educated, to see if what we think is reality.
Yeah.
And then if we get more convicted, it's like, all right, we know in our gut this is a good sector that we want to look at. And then we get to that proof stage. Well, prove it to me that you're a good company. Show me your financials and all of that. So we'll do proprietary outreach to those companies that we're interested in, but we'll also look at business brokers and investment bankers that are marketing deals, right? And similar to on the investment banking side, for our business, we want to aggressively market those businesses to known buyers versus try and chase somebody or talk them into buying something.
Yeah.
So it's really a dance between proprietary deal flow and represented deals.
So then in that scenario, like the off-market deal search though is something that is part of what you do, but it's also not exclusively. You keep your options open, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, and really the quality of the representation too. In many ways, educating a seller on the process without an intermediary involved is a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
Now you may be able to buy it a little bit lower price because you've developed the relationship, and you might be one of one or one of two that they're talking to instead of one of 10.
Yeah.
But it's also a lot of work. So you have to also rely on the ecosystem to develop deals and present them to you, especially if you get a reputation for being a good buyer. You'll get some of those opportunities in your inbox, so to speak.
So what if Art and I here, we say, you know what, let's do this. And again, I say this, I have been looking at home service business, but if Art and I would just pick the plumbing and we're going to start This Is the Way plumbing business, not start it. We're going to acquire, actually, I don't even want to go into renaming it. We'll keep its name because I know there's other complexities. You've tried to do any of that, but is that a good or a bad idea when individuals are entering a market where they don't really have direct experience?
You're going to pay a little dumb tax, right? You're going to make some mistakes if you don't have direct experience. But the other way to look at that is, let's say you guys, obviously you have, podcast experience, you have marketing experience, you have other skill sets to bring to that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are plenty of world-class plumbing companies that have amazing reputations, but they are horrible marketers. So if that's part of your skill set, you can say, look, I trust my team to know how to do the plumbing, but I'm going to bring some value to this equation, and I'm going to pump up the volume from a marketing standpoint because all of these rock stars on my team should not be unknown to the marketplace, right? Let's go ring the bell several times, right? So I wouldn't say it's now, most deals have, 4 people involved. They have the buyer, the seller, the IRS, and a bank. Mm-hmm. And so your bank is going to look at you and go, well, what makes you think that you can make money in this business because you don't know it?
Sure.
And the degree to which you can prepare and study and look at 7 plumbing companies instead of just one and decide that's a good deal. Now you've got more legs to stand on around, selling that to the SBA or whatever your ambition is with the size of that company.
Sure, that makes sense. So basically teeing up, so Art and I, background being, and I'm using this example again for anybody else who's out there thinking about it, but all right, executives, Disney, Netflix,
Yep.
consultant on the business, side of things, you're teeing that up, showing that to the bank as part of the overall business plan that shows that you have a lot of thought around this, and then bringing to that the edge that you could bring on the marketing side because of XYZ makes it a little bit easier for them to swallow, as well as convinces yourself a little more of, oh, okay, good, I can bring this, process, this,
A little
marketing,
pep
etc.
talk.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And the adjacencies to your skill set, right? If you think about Disney and creative, and well, creative is part of it, but if you're more on the distribution side and the scaling side of the business, right, how does that relate to the business that you're working with? Or even as an executive, you're consultative in what you do. That can translate even to a plumbing business, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's a fun dance, but you also have to be passionate about it at the end, right? You got to believe in what you're doing ultimately. Those people that, and I hear it all the time, right? Well, I want to get into car wash because it's passive income. People just show up. And I want to get into storage because people just set it and forget it. And I want to get into laundromats, right? Well, if you're open 24/7 in a laundromat and the coin change maker breaks down, who gets the call, right?
Yeah,
There's no such thing. So
yeah, I learned that with my short-term rental as a passive, and don't get me wrong, it's still been good to me. There's still learn a lot, and there are pieces that can absolutely be automated, and there were a lot of benefits, but there's still that. And it's still, when it comes down to it, I'm like, that I bought on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast. So that means at checkout, if there's questions, 10 a.m. checkout them, 7 a.m. for me, I got to be ready to, field, or something else happens and the power's out. All those things are like, ugh. But yeah. And I think that is anytime anymore anybody sells passive, I'm just like, okay, the closest you get to that maybe is like stocks. There are certain ways that you can be passive,
sure.
but where's the fun in those? I'm curious too for funding. What are, like, for individuals, again, I'm just taking it back because this is just a more clear example. So we've got this 6 million, but we're like, let's do this. We're going on it, and from a funding perspective, if we're like, you know what, we may not want to bring all of our money to this, like, what are some interesting creative ways that you've seen that happen for business acquisition?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, it all depends on the scale and scope. And I'll give a plug, on the investment banking side and the businesses that we're buying, we're typically working with 20 million and up. So you've got institutional lenders and all of that, but that's okay. We're looking, and for the add-ons, oftentimes you're looking for smaller businesses. If you're an entrepreneur or would-be entrepreneur, the SBA is your friend, right? The government provides, some backing, if you will, or backstopping to your local lender. And so, they're your friend. They're probably your cheapest source of capital outside of the seller themselves. So that's a great avenue. There's always friends and family, right, which may want to help you with an equity downstroke or what have you. So you're not putting up all the dough. And then there's OPM, right? Other people's money, which is more of a kind of arm's length versus friends and family. So you have to think about that and think about Thanksgiving dinner and think about seeing that person at the gym and all of that, right? So there's always strings attached when you're using other people's money. But yeah, you can, and I think really, and as you go down market, so to speak, into that kind of Main Street type business, $6 million plumbing business, that seller, every seller thinks they have, multiple options. Oh, my employee XYZ is going to buy me out someday, or my son's going to buy me out, or daughter, or whatever.
Meanwhile, son and daughter's like, can we get out of this business already? Yeah.
Yeah. Or they're like, hey, unless it has a .com behind it, I'm not interested, right? Or whatever their thing is. And then the employee, unless you've been grossly overpaying the employee, he probably doesn't have the money to buy you out, right? And you end up being the bank forever, right? Mm-hmm. So, if you're buying a business, that seller doesn't have a ton of options always for liquidity. Mm-hmm. So they do end up being the bank in terms of a seller note. So they'll help you finance the deal if they want to get their liquidity out over time.
Yeah.
And that's a promise to pay, right? So you're on the hook for that. There's other ways if you're not quite, or if you're trying to bridge the gap between what they want and what you're willing to pay. There's ways to do earnouts and, like, right, have them, if we do 7 million next year, I'll pay you an extra whatever, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of different strategies that you can get a deal done. The underlying is an appropriate mix of debt, and allowing the business to service that debt as well as bringing some equity to the table. And the degree to which you can get the seller to help you with that is really the sweet spot.
What are some of the bigger mistakes that you've seen as either, you guys or people that you've witnessed acquiring companies that was like oops, gotcha afterwards?
Well, let's take some recent, examples. Everybody models out when the cost of money was 2%, right? They model it out at 2%. Well, do they model it out at 11%? Right? You gotta model the downside. What it Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, where they called it inversion thinking, right? Everybody wants to think about it always goes up and to the right? Oh, and under my leadership, we're going to grow at 27%. Well, what if it goes down 27%, right? So I think being overly optimistic or kind of drinking the Kool-Aid, if you're an investor, you need to think equally about risk as you do of upside. And, every buyer has two primary emotions, fear and greed. When you get too greedy, bad things happen. And when, you're not thinking about that fear and that downside, bad things happen as well. So that's principally the biggest mistakes I've seen.
What about on the working capital front? Because I know a few friends who I feel like run into that. They don't consider all the working capital or what might be tied up in your accounts.
Yeah, entrepreneurs typically they understand the profit and loss, right? That statement. Many of them take a lot of years to figure out balance sheet, and that's where the real value is in your business. And even fewer figure out that cash flow is what makes it all happen, right? I mean, if you don't have blood in your arteries, you're dead, right? So there's a cool little saying that revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is king. That from a mistake standpoint and from a working capital standpoint, hey, we're up 40% this year. Well, what is the cost and the amount of cash that it takes you to support that growth and buy inventory and all of those things? So, getting a good CPA, getting a good controller, having great conversations with your bank frequently. So many people hold their bank off until it's too late. But if you involve them in those conversations when it gets tough, you've already had the conversations and you're like, hey, I need a little bit more working capital. Will you work with me? Here's my plan, right? Those are always important milestones when you have to have those hard conversations.
And do you think it's a better idea to always look at having more working capital out of the gate, or just know that because it could cost you more to do that right away, or just do something like maybe what sounds like you're kind of describing where you're just like, I could be back, don't need it now, but if I do, we good?
Yeah, it's always a mix of both. There's that old adage that, banks never lend you money when you need it, only when they want to lend you money when you don't need it, right? And having a couple of strategies, again, because if cash is king, you need to have an A, B, C, and D plan, right? And I'll go back to the beginning of our conversation around the subscription model, right? And why I like that so much, right? If a credit card gets hit on the first of the month, what are your working capital needs for that month? They're satisfied by your customer, right?
Yeah.
So there's probably some things about your model. Let's take another example, suppliers to contractors. They say, well, in the contracting business, we don't get paid for 120 days because our customer doesn't pay us, right? So you're eating up a lot of working capital just to float your industry because the norm is 120 days. Okay, well, that's the norm, but what if you offered them a 3% discount to pay within 10 days? Your bigger contractors that you're servicing would probably take you up on that, right? Because they're well capitalized. So there's a lot of tips and strategies that you can deploy depending upon your industry to kind of minimize that working capital. And also collecting your receivables aggressively is a great way to do that, right?
That's a great point.
Yeah. So a lot of it comes back to the fundamentals, right? When I see the basketball jersey, right? So, if you're not running the fundamentals and running your plays and, all of that, you're not going to get anywhere. So much of business, people think it's cult of personality. It's blocking and tackling, and it's, trapping and, doing all those fundies.
On that note, obviously you have a good framework that you thought about. You've mentioned before to me about a roadmap for deal flow and company analysis. And I was just curious, I think you said it's a 5-point roadmap. And if you could walk us through what that looks like, unless I've oversimplified that.
Yeah, no, it varies by industry. It varies by company. I think, and there's two aspects, and I've alluded to a couple of them. The first goal is to make sure you're in the ecosystem to be able to see deals and to see enough deals. Because if you see 3 deals, maybe 2 out of the 3 will look good. But if you see 30, maybe only 1 out of the 30 looks good because you have a wider subset to compare it against, right? And there's always, like I said, there's leaders, neutrals, and laggards in a given business or a sector or an industry, so you're going to want that comparison. Then usually the first step after that, once you get that deal flow, is to really do a rigorous financial analysis, because at the end of the day, you're buying a stream of cash flows. As boring and accounting and ish as that sounds, you want to make sure that not only the past cash flows work and that they're, fairly repeatable. We don't have a great year one year and a crummy year the next, right? You want to look for that stability. But most importantly, are those cash flows going to continue for the next several years, provided you don't mess it up, right? So, really analyzing the business from that standpoint, and then going back and comparing it against other businesses, because you'll learn a lot about your business and where you sit as a leader, neutral, or laggard by that comparison, and getting deep on the financial side of it. And then going back to team, marketplace, areas for growth and expansion. The marketplace is a pretty efficient thing. So if you're going to pay somebody what their business is worth, if you really want it, you might have to pay a little bit more, right? If you're going to do that, the only way you win is by growing the business, because growing the business will allow you a little bit of profit, and it'll also allow you to service your debt and create something more valuable. So really then looking at the growth prospects for that given business or that given industry, and if I had to select, would I select a business that's growing at the rate of GDP, at the rate of inflation? To me, that screams treading water, right? Why would I want to tread water and just pay my debt down and hopefully sell someday, right? Do I have enough investment to put back into the next technology or the next leading thing? So that's really, finding that growth opportunity. It's hard. Not everybody has that. And some are riding the life cycle wave down, right? In a mature business. At the turn of the century, if you were selling buggy whips, you're not quite doing that now, right? So you got to be careful.
Although watchable shirts, there's going to be somebody making a killing selling those as, antiques.
That's right. What goes around comes around, right?
Yeah. On the financial analysis that you mentioned, is that, when you say that, is that the upfront sort of where you're looking at and saying, okay, here's what's forecasted, or are you talking more of like a QE, quality of earnings study, or the combination of both when you say it?
Yeah, I think, you're always in this business, you're looking for kind of milestones or signs. When I was a kid, we used to get grades, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, right? Now, my youngest twins are 11 and they're getting, conditions for success, right?
Oh my
So
goodness,
it's like,
that's
are
hilarious.
these things happening, right? So the first sign is a seller willing to give you 3 to 5 years worth of financials and tax returns, right? That's a good sign that he's actively wanting to sell or she's actively wanting to sell. So you start with that level of scrutiny and see if it passes the smell test. But you're absolutely right. When it gets post letter of intent and you're really starting to diligence this opportunity, that's when you just, the numbers can tell a lot, but you got to dig to get at them, right? And look at the trends, look at the trend analysis, sensitivity analysis, all that kind of unfun stuff. But that's where the quality of earnings and some of the other, you're bringing in professional CPAs to make sure the accounting is right. You're actually getting what you paid for, so to speak.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's a lot of obviously analysis, whether it's financial analysis or just analyzing how the business is doing in different areas. For somebody that's never done this before and wants to, buy something on the smaller side because it's their first rodeo, how would you recommend somebody be prepared to understand all these analysis? Is it before they get started, or once they have identified a company, then bring in experts? Like how would you recommend somebody to go about this?
Yeah, great question. And it's certainly, ChatGPT, the internet. I mean, you can do your own self-study. And there's a group of buyers out there called search funders, which are typically MBA students, and they may be really book smart, but they may not have a whole lot of experience, right? So you've really got to surround yourself with the proper resources. But certainly it starts with, more than just an idea. You got to do your homework, right? And you got to get educated as best you can. And then depending upon your appetite and your budget, right? You can go out and hire McKinsey to tell you what to go buy, right? And they'll do a study and charge you $250,000 or more. But if you don't have that kind of budget or or patience, if you will. Surround yourself with people that have done it before. Surround yourself with that sage mentor that has bought and sold 3 or 4 companies, and they'll give you their own list of here's the 5 important things you got to look at, or here's our past diligence list. It's you can surround yourself with the right size talent, and then if you're getting into a bigger transaction, you're going to want a good attorney, a good CPA, a good investment banker, again, to save you the dumb tax, because they've been there, done that. And a lot of people think, well, if I just have a great relationship with the seller, I'll get this thing across the finish line.
Yeah.
Doesn't always work that way, right? So you can have the best relationship in the world, but if you stumble, and, the adage in our business on the investment banking side is, time kills all deals. So if you don't get this thing to a close within a reasonable time frame, you can have the best company and the best, seller and all of those things. But if you can't get the mechanics and the technical things down, I've seen a lot of deals crash that way. So you really have to be intentional and surround yourself with the right people and bring them in, as it's appropriate, right? You're not going to have a lawyer start drafting a purchase and sale agreement, right? Day one when you're starting your diligence, right? Because you may blow 50 grand before you know it, right? And the deal falls apart. So you want to pace and meter those things out. And sometimes while you're pressing to get a deal done and time kills all deals, you also have to let it unfold and reveal itself so that you're in your mind, you're going, yep, I like that answer. I like the team. I like the revenue durability. I like the profitability. I don't see any skeletons in the closet. The people seem happy and smiling, right, when I walk around the facility. So you got to let it breathe a little bit at the same time.
Around the idea of when you buy real estate. Now, don't get me wrong. The complexity of buying a business, I feel, is so much greater. But the idea here is at first, you're looking at all these ones, trying to figure out, especially if you're doing it from an investment perspective, as I was doing with our vacation rental. And that whole period of time, at first you might put in actually different offers, around some of these businesses, or letters of intent, in the case of buying a business. But then after that, your due diligence. And that's when, again, you bring in all those other ones, instead of it being your inspector to look at your house or, any of that, you're bringing in these different level of experts that you have now at a higher price than you would need to for the other one, because of the amount of work that they need to do to dig into it. It's not just a title search. But my brain has always at least liked that similarity to think about it, even though I know I'm oversimplifying in the long run, but it's that sort of idea that you get something under contract, and then that's where you can do some of this research around the team and the other things like that, obviously assuming your contract is set up in a way that gives you that out, and you don't have
I agree with you. And it goes back to your risk tolerance, right? Because let's say you're buying a multifamily apartment building. It's got, 6 units. It's a small real estate, right? You know that there's established market. You can look at comps. And even if you're not the right owner, or you make some mistakes or whatever, there's an asset value there, and there's a marketplace that will sell that. Now, you may take it on the chin, 10, 20%, whatever equity you put down, right, if things go wrong. Mm-hmm. But sometimes companies can go to zero.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's even more important to have those experts and have those multiple voices in your ear going, okay, here are the things I'm concerned with. How do we mitigate that risk? Because it's a little safer to buy something that you can scratch and sniff and kick and post for sale the next day. Right. Whereas if you have a problem child company, it may take you a year or two to kind of turn that thing around.
All right. So if you could go back in time and give yourself a key piece of advice, what would it be?
Probably be start earlier. And I started at, 26 with my first company, right? So, but, I see kids today, there's kids on YouTube that are 13, right? And it's just like everything has been compressed, right?
Yeah.
So I would just say, take a risk, start earlier. I spent 10, 12 years in corporate America, and I learned a heck of a lot, but, knowing my temperament now in hindsight, I'd say, don't be afraid, start earlier.
I'm with you. That would be similar advice I'd give. That's one of the things
I would like, exact same advice I would give myself too.
Yeah, it's like, come on, yeah. Awesome. How can people find you?
So they can find me at Craig Dickens on LinkedIn. That's usually a good spot. Merit Investment Bank is our investment bank where we help people, buy and sell businesses and, raise capital for growth equity and growth debt. My email address there is craig.dickens@meritinvestmentbank.com. So those are usually the best places. You can also find me occasionally on Twitter at M&A Exit.
Okay, M&A Exit. Okay, got it. And then
we'll make sure to link to all those in the show notes.
Yeah, terrific.
And for those who might want to reach out to, just kind of going back to it, like your optimal, don't want to call it customer, but lack of a better way to put it, like those who you're generally working with, is that like people who are looking at, again, a certain type of business size, or is it more those who are looking for an exit? Like what is the best?
Yeah, we do, we do a predominant amount of our work is what we call sell side, where we're helping founders and entrepreneurs sell their businesses. And, typically that starts around $2 million in earnings, roughly around 20 million in transaction value, or roughly 20 million in sales. Now, a tech company might only be 10 million in sales, but 5 million of that might be recurring revenue. So, but certainly those are the kind of companies that I think we can provide the most value. And the fact that most of our folks have entrepreneurial roots, we've kind of been where they've been. So, we get to speak from real experience versus financial engineering only, right?
Makes sense. Awesome. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. We're going to go buy business.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I'm going to find business right now because this was very motivating.
Keep me posted, man. Let's work on one together. That'll be fun.
Let's do it. We appreciate it. And if anybody has more comments or questions, please drop them below because we would love to hear what you think. And see you on the next one.